Welcome, dear listeners, to this cozy audiobook adventure, Miss Marple and the Quilting Circle. Settle in with a cup of tea as we journey to the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s, where secrets unravel like a loose thread. Narrated in the timeless style of Agatha Christie, this tale features our beloved elderly detective, Miss Jane Marple, whose keen eye for human nature solves even the most puzzling mysteries. Relax and enjoy. Let the intrigue begin. Chapter 1. The Village Stitch. The village of St. Mary Mead lay dozing under a pale September sun, the sort of sun that seems to have forgotten how to be warm and merely hangs in the sky like a polite guest who has overstayed. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, rooks wheeled above the church tower, and the only sound to disturb the hush was the distant clop of the baker's cart and the occasional bleat of a sheep that had wandered too far from the meadow. It was 1952, and rationing still pinched, but in St. Mary Mead one pretended not to notice such things. One simply made smaller cakes and drank weaker tea and carried on with the quiet business of living. At the eastern end of the high street stood Miss Jane Marple's cottage, a neat, rose-clad dwelling with a green door and windows that gleamed like kindly eyes. Inside, in the small sitting room that smelled faintly of lavender polish and wood smoke, Miss Marple herself sat in her favorite chintz-covered armchair, her fingers moving with the unhurried precision of long practice over a piece of pale blue knitting. The wool was intended for a baby's layette Mrs. Bantry's daughter-in-law was expecting again, though Miss Marple privately doubted whether the child would arrive before the sleeves were finished. Babies, she had observed, were inclined to be inconsiderate about timing. From her window she could see almost the whole village spread out like a sampler worked in soft greens and grays. There was the post office, the butcher's with its striped awning, the Blue Boar doing modest midday trade, and just beyond the Lich Gate, the old village hall where every Tuesday at 2:30, the St. Mary Mead Quilting Circle held its meetings. The hall had been built in the reign of Queen Anne, repaired after a bomb fell inconveniently close in 1941, and was now the undisputed center of village life. Its stone walls were thick, its windows high and narrow, and its floorboards creaked in a friendly, familiar way that made secrets feel almost at home. Today was Tuesday, and at 2:20 Miss Marple laid her knitting in her lap and watched the little procession begin. First came Mrs. Eleanor Price, erect and formidable in a bottle green coat and a hat trimmed with a pheasant's feather that looked as though it had been placed there by an act of Parliament. Mrs. Price had been president of the Quilting Circle for 15 years and ruled it with the calm certainty of a duchess. She carried a large basket covered with a snowy cloth. Beneath it, Miss Marple knew, lay her special tin of shortbread and the silver thimble that had belonged to her mother. Next appeared Violet Hargreaves, hurrying along with short, anxious steps, clutching a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Violet was 47, unmarried, and had the faded prettiness of a pressed flower. She had been Mrs. Price's shadow for as long as anyone could remember, cutting patterns, threading needles, soothing ruffled feelings, and absorbing, with the patience of a saint, every slight and sharp word that came her way. Today her cheeks were pinker than usual, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as though expecting pursuit. Reginald Thorne, the grocer, ambled past a moment later, mopping his bald head with a large handkerchief even though the day was cool. He had joined the circle 2 years ago after his wife died, explaining that he wished to complete the quilt she had begun. The ladies had received him kindly, though some said privately that a grocer's fingers were better suited to weighing sugar than wielding a needle. Reginald carried a paper bag that probably contained currants or candied peel. He was famous for his contributions to the tea table. Then came Lydia Blackwood, sailing down the street like a bright yacht among fishing boats. Lydia was new to the village, less than a year, and still regarded as a novelty. She wore a cherry-red coat with a fur collar and shoes that clicked importantly on the pavement. She had come down from London for a little peace, she said, though no one could quite imagine Lydia peaceful. She carried no sewing basket. Her contribution to the circle, she claimed, was inspiration. Last of all, almost hidden beneath an ancient umbrella, though no rain threatened, shuffled Mr. Humphrey Digby, retired schoolmaster and self-appointed guardian of village history. He was 80 if he was a day, thin as a heron, and possessed of a voice that quavered like a flute with a cracked reed. He brought with him a folder of yellowed documents and the firm conviction that the quilt they were making ought to include the Digby family crest, preferably in the center. Miss Marple watched them all disappear into the hall, then picked up her knitting again. She had been invited to join the circle many times. Her French knots were legendary, but she always refused with a gentle smile. "I prefer to observe," she said. And indeed, observation was her particular talent. People, she had discovered long ago, were like knitting patterns. If one studied them carefully, one could see where the stitches would lead. Inside the village hall, the long table had been set out with the quilt frame, a handsome oak rectangle that took 6 people to carry. The quilt itself was a wonder, 12 feet by 10, worked in the intricate tree-of-life pattern, with appliqued leaves in every shade of green and tiny embroidered birds hidden among the branches. It was intended for the grand raffle at the autumn fete, and every lady in the circle felt a proprietary interest in its perfection. Mrs. Price took her place at the head of the table and surveyed her kingdom. "We must finish the border by the end of October," she announced. "The bishop himself has promised to draw the winning ticket." There was a respectful murmur. The bishop was a connection worth having. Tea was served at 3:30 as always. Violet poured, her hands trembling slightly as she handed Mrs. Price her cup, the one with the pink roses that was always reserved for the president. Mrs. Price added 2 lumps of sugar from the communal bowl, stirred, and took a genteel sip. Conversation flowed. The price of cotton thread. The scandal of young Doris at the dairy. The best way to set in a sleeve. Mrs. Price set her cup down and reached for her needle. "Now," she said briskly, "the acorns along the lower edge want shading. Violet, dear, pass me the brown silk." Violet obeyed, threading the needle with the quick, nervous movements of a bird. Mrs. Price moistened the thread between her lips, an old habit, though she had been warned about germs, and bent over her work. It was at that precise moment that something changed. A faint flush rose in Mrs. Price's cheeks, then ebbed away, leaving her strangely pale. She gave a small, puzzled frown, as though someone had spoken out of turn. "I feel," she began, and then her voice trailed away. The needle slipped from her fingers and fell with a tiny clink onto the quilt. She pressed a hand to her throat, gasped once, and slid sideways in her chair. For one astonished second, nobody moved. Then the room exploded into sound. Violet screamed, a high, thin sound like a kettle coming to the boil. Lydia dropped her teacup, which shattered into rose-patterned fragments. Reginald half rose, his chair scraping backwards, while Mr. Digby peered over his spectacles with the mild interest of a man observing an unexpected natural phenomenon. "Eleanor!" Violet cried, clutching at the limp arm. "Oh, someone do something!" Reginald lumbered forward and felt clumsily for a pulse. She's gone," he said, his voice cracking. "Just like that." Outside, the sun continued its pale shining, and the rooks wheeled undisturbed above the church tower. Inside the village hall, the tree-of-life quilt lay quietly beneath Mrs. Price's outstretched hand, its embroidered leaves trembling slightly in the draught from the open door. By the time Dr. Haydock arrived, summoned by a white-faced boy dispatched on a bicycle, the ladies were gathered in a shocked little knot at the far end of the room. The doctor, a kindly man with a limp from the first war, made his examination with gentle efficiency. "Heart failure," he said at last, closing his bag. Poor Eleanor. She always did drive herself too hard. No one thought to question the verdict. People dropped dead in villages. It was one of the things they did. The quilt was carefully rolled, the tea things cleared away, and by 6 o'clock the hall was empty except for the faint scent of Earl Grey and shortbread. But in her cottage, Miss Marple heard the news from Cherry, who had heard it from the butcher's wife, who had heard it from the boy who had fetched the doctor. Cherry was round-eyed with excitement. Dropped dead at the quilting just like that. Heart attack, Dr. Haydock says. Isn't it dreadful, miss? Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and gazed out at the gathering dusk. Dreadful indeed, she murmured. But Eleanor Price was a strong woman, Cherry, strong as a horse, and horses do not drop dead without reason. Cherry waited, but Miss Marple said no more. She merely picked up her knitting again, though her needles moved more slowly now, and her mild blue eyes held a thoughtful gleam that would have warned anyone who knew her well that something somewhere had pricked her curiosity as sharply as any quilting needle. Outside, the first star pricked the darkening sky, and St. Mary Mead settled down for the night. Little knowing that the quiet Tuesday killing for killing Miss Marple was already certain. It was only the first loose thread in a pattern that would soon begin to unravel. Chapter 2. Threads of Suspicion. The following morning broke gray and fretful, with a wind that worried the last leaves from the lime trees and sent them skittering along the high street like guilty secrets. By 9 o'clock, the news of Mrs. Price's sudden death had completed its circuit of the village 3 times, growing a little with each telling, until it seemed she had expired in the very act of pronouncing judgment on someone's running stitch. At the post office, people queued in silence for stamps and pension books, yet every soul was listening to the conversation behind the wire grill, where Miss Hartnell was informing Miss Weatherby in a piercing whisper that defeated its own purpose, that poor Eleanor had looked ever so peculiar just before she fell. Miss Marple, wrapped in her old gray coat and a woolen scarf the color of wood smoke, set out soon after breakfast on what she described to Cherry as a little marketing, though her basket remained conspicuously empty. She moved slowly, pausing to exchange greetings with the vicar, to admire Mrs. Butt's dahlias, to inquire after old Mr. Polk's rheumatism. And in this way she gathered more genuine information in 20 minutes than Inspector Slack would extract in a week of official questioning. By the time she reached the village hall, the sky had cleared to a thin, cold blue, and the building stood waiting like a stage from which the principal player had been abruptly removed. Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham in a black Wolseley that looked aggressively official among the cottages. He was a large man with a red face and a mustache trained to bristle on command, and he had already decided that the death of Mrs. Eleanor Price was a distressing but uncomplicated instance of coronary failure in a woman of advancing years. Paperwork, he felt, could be kept to a minimum. He stood now in the hall, notebook in hand, while the members of the quilting circle sat in a forlorn semicircle beneath the rolled-up quilt like mourners at a particularly uncomfortable wake. Violet Hargreaves was crying quietly into a handkerchief already sodden. Every few moments she gave a hiccuping sob that seemed to surprise even herself. Reginald Thorne kept clearing his throat and polishing his spectacles on a corner of his apron which he had forgotten to remove. Lydia Blackwood had lit a cigarette in a long amber holder and was exhaling smoke towards the rafters with an air of studied detachment that deceived nobody. Mr. Digby, perched on the edge of his chair, clutched his folder of historical notes as though it might protect him from the present. Slack cleared his throat importantly. Now then, nothing to get alarmed about. Just a few routine questions. Who made the tea yesterday? Violet lifted a blotched face. I did. I always do. There's nothing wrong with the tea, Inspector, I'm sure. Mrs. Price took 2 lumps, just as usual, and... Quite. Slack interrupted, making a note that looked suspiciously like a doodle of a battleship. And who was sitting closest to Mrs. Price? That would be me, Reginald said heavily. On her left, and Miss Blackwood on her right. But Eleanor was perfectly all right 1 minute and, well, gone the next. Lydia tapped ash into a cracked saucer someone had provided. She did complain of feeling hot, she offered. I remember that. Said the room was stuffy, but then she was always complaining about something. Violet gave a small wounded cry, and Reginald shot Lydia a look of reproach. Mr. Digby merely blinked and murmured something about the importance of ventilation in public buildings. Miss Marple, who had slipped quietly into a chair near the door, observed them all with the mild interest she might give to an unfamiliar species of beetle. She noticed that Violet's left cuff bore a tiny crimson thread caught in the buttonhole, exactly the shade used for the quilt's pomegranates. She noticed that Reginald's hands trembled as he returned his spectacles to his nose, and that Lydia's scarlet fingernails had left minute crescents in the palm of her hand where she had clenched it. She noticed, too, that Mr. Digby's shoelace was untied, a small domestic tragedy that seemed to distress him more than the death itself. When Slack turned to her, she had been pointed out by the vicar's wife as someone who notices things. Miss Marple smiled serenely. I wasn't present yesterday, Inspector, but I have known Eleanor Price for 40 years. She had the constitution of an ox and the stubbornness of a mule. If she died of a heart attack, I shall be very much surprised. Slack bristled quite as effectively as his mustache. Doctors know their business, Miss Marple, Jane Marple. And doctors, like policemen, are sometimes too quick to accept the obvious. She rose, smoothing her gloves. But I mustn't keep you from your duties. Outside, the wind had dropped and the village lay hushed under the weak sun. Miss Marple paused on the steps of the hall and looked back once. Through the open door, she could see the corner of the long table where Eleanor Price had sat, and on it the pink rose cup still standing where Violet had placed it yesterday. A small, fragile monument to a life abruptly ended. A single brown leaf had blown in and settled on the saucer like a question mark. As she walked home past the war memorial, Miss Marple's mind was busy with the little incongruities that had already presented themselves. The faint flush on Eleanor's cheeks that Reginald had not mentioned. The way Violet's hands had shaken when she passed the sugar. The odd, almost furtive glance Lydia had given the quilt when she thought no one was watching. They were the tiniest of stitches, barely visible. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning that the strength of any fabric lies in the threads one cannot see. By the time she reached her gate, she had made up her mind. She would accept the standing invitation to the quilting circle after all. Not, as the ladies imagined, to lend her skill with a needle, but to sit quietly in the corner and watch the pattern of human behavior emerge, one careful stitch at a time. For somewhere among those grieving, flustered people was a hand that had deliberately cut a life short, and Miss Marple intended to discover whose it was before the loosened thread unraveled any further. Chapter 3. A pattern emerges. The inquest was held 3 days later in the same village hall, an irony that no one seemed willing to mention aloud. Chairs had been arranged in solemn rows, the quilt frame pushed into a corner like an embarrassed relative, and a smell of damp hymn books mingled uneasily with the lingering ghost of Earl Grey. Dr. Haydock gave his evidence with the weary certainty of a man who had signed too many death certificates. Mrs. Eleanor Price had died of acute heart failure, probably precipitated by overwork and the natural degeneration of the cardiac muscle. There was nothing, in his opinion, to suggest anything but natural causes. The coroner, a thin gentleman from Much Benham who kept polishing his pince-nez, nodded several times and looked relieved. Verdict: death by natural causes. The jury, consisting of 7 local worthies who had known Eleanor since childhood, Took exactly 4 minutes to agree. Miss Marple, sitting at the back in her dove-gray coat and a hat trimmed with a modest violet, listened with the attentive politeness she might give to a sermon she had heard before. When the proceedings ended and the little crowd began to disperse into the pale afternoon light, she remained in her seat for a moment, watching the way people avoided one another's eyes. Violet Hargreaves hurried past with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Reginald Thorne stood helplessly by the door as though waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. Lydia Blackwood lit another cigarette before she was even outside, and old Mr. Digby folded his historical notes with finicky care, as though the creases mattered more than anything else in the world. That evening the vicarage drawing-room was warm with lamplight and the scent of buttered toast. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, had invited Miss Marple to tea for a little comfortable gossip, which in St. Mary Mead meant a thorough post-mortem of the inquest. The vicar himself was safely occupied in the study with next Sunday's sermon, leaving the ladies free to speak plainly. "I still can't believe it," Mrs. Clement said, passing a plate of scones. "Eleanor gone just like that, and at the quilting of all places. One does feel it might have been arranged with a little more consideration." Miss Marple took a scone and broke it neatly in two. "Death is rarely considerate, my dear, though in this case I wonder whether it was entirely natural." She spoke softly, yet Mrs. Clement's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "You mean foul play?" "I mean," Miss Marple said, spreading blackberry jam with delicate precision, "that Eleanor Price was not the sort of woman to die conveniently in the middle of a sentence. She prided herself on finishing what she began, and there are one or two small things that trouble me." She proceeded to list them as calmly as if she were discussing the shortcomings of a knitting pattern. The faint bluish tinge Dr. Haydock had noticed round Eleanor's lips and dismissed as post-mortem lividity. The way Violet had twice refilled the sugar bowl that afternoon, though it was barely half empty. The curious fact that Eleanor had complained only the previous week of a tingling in her fingertips and a bitter taste in her mouth, symptoms she had attributed to arthritis and too much strong tea. Mrs. Clement set her cup down with a clatter. "But the doctor said—" "Doctors are excellent men," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "but they see what they expect to see. And no one expected murder in a quilting circle." The next morning Miss Marple paid a call on Violet Hargreaves, carrying a small jar of calf's foot jelly as a pretext. Violet's cottage was one of a row behind the church, neat as a pin and smelling of beeswax and regret. She received her visitor with the air of a frightened mouse granted an audience with a cat. "I don't know how I shall go on," Violet said, twisting a damp handkerchief into knots. "Mrs. Price managed everything, the quilt, the fete, the accounts. I was only her assistant." Tears welled again. "She could be sharp, you know, but she meant well. And now they say she left me the quilting funds, in her will, only conditionally, of course, and I never expected— Oh dear, I feel quite faint." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You must rest, my dear. Tell me, did Mrs. Price take any medicine for her heart?" Violet shook her head. "Never. She said doctors were all fools and fresh air was the only tonic worth having." On her way home, Miss Marple stopped at the grocer's. Reginald Thorne was weighing sugar for old Mrs. Sims, but his hands shook so badly that the scales rocked like a boat in a storm. "Terrible business," he said when Mrs. Sims had gone. "Eleanor and I had words last month. She thought I'd shortchanged the fete funds, ridiculous woman. But I'd never have wished her harm. Never." He wiped his forehead with the apron that still bore faint flowery ghosts of yesterday. Mind you, she had been buying foxglove seeds from the catalogue. Said they were pretty in the border. Funny thing for a heart patient, isn't it? Miss Marple bought half a pound of tea she did not need and walked on, her mind turning over this new scrap like a smooth pebble. foxgloves, digitalis, heart medicine in small doses, deadly poison in large. And Eleanor Price had grown them herself. That afternoon found her in the cool, herb-scented depths of Dr. Haydock's dispensary. The doctor greeted her with the affectionate exasperation of a man who had known her for 50 years. "Come to tell me I've missed something, Jane. Only to ask whether you tested poor Eleanor's blood for anything unusual." Haydock frowned. There was no reason. Heart failure is common enough. But now you mention it, her pupils were rather contracted, and there was a suggestion of garlic on the breath, though that might have been the shortbread. Why? Miss Marple merely smiled and changed the subject to the price of aspirin. By the time she reached her own gate, the pattern was beginning to show itself, faint as the first penciled lines on a fresh quilt block. Foxgloves in Eleanor's garden, symptoms dismissed. A sugar bowl refilled too often. A will that benefited a timid woman who had lived in another's shadow for decades. Nothing certain yet, only the glimmer of a shape beneath the surface. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that murder, like quilting, begins with the tiniest of stitches, and she intended to follow everyone until the whole design lay clear before her mild, deceptively innocent eyes. Chapter 4. Loose ends. The post-mortem report arrived on a morning so still that the village seemed to be holding its breath. Dr. Haydock telephoned Inspector Slack first, then, after a long pause and a clearing of the throat that could be heard across the exchange, asked to speak to Miss Marple. She listened without comment while he read the salient points in the careful voice doctor's reserved for relatives. A massive dose of digitalis absorbed slowly, almost certainly over several days. Traces in the stomach, but the greater concentration, in the blood. Death mercifully swift once the final quantity tipped the balance. The sugar taken at the quilting circle had contained enough to finish what earlier doses had begun. Someone had planned the matter with patience and precision. By lunchtime, the news had threaded its way along every garden path and shop counter. Murder, deliberate and cold-blooded, had come to St. Mary Mead in the guise of 2 innocent lumps of sugar. Doors that had never known a key were locked for the first time in living memory. Mothers called children in from play, and the quilting circle, once the gentlest assembly imaginable, was spoken of in the same breath as Borgia poisons and Borgia popes. Inspector Slack descended again, angrier than before, convinced that the original verdict had made him look a fool. He set up headquarters in the village hall, demanded the pink rose cup, the sugar bowl, the teapot, the entire contents of the tea tray. Fingerprints were taken with much ceremony and little result. The ladies, after all, had handled everything repeatedly while trying to revive poor Eleanor. Slack interviewed the circle again, one by one, in the chilly committee room that smelled of chalk and disapproval. Reginald Thorne bore the brunt. Slack had discovered that Eleanor had lent him £300 2 years earlier when his shop nearly foundered, a loan repayable when convenient, which in Eleanor's lexicon meant whenever she chose to call it in. She had chosen, apparently, the week before she died. "I was going to pay her back after the fete," Reginald protested, mopping his face, though the room was cold. "She knew that. We argued, yes, everyone heard us, but argue and murder are different things, Inspector." Slack remained unimpressed. He had also learned that Reginald's fingerprints were on the sugar bowl, hardly surprising since Reginald had replenished the sugar every week for years. By tea time, Reginald was helping police with their inquiries at Much Benham Station, and the village, relieved to have a culprit who was neither female nor elderly, began to breathe more easily. Miss Marple, however, did not. She sat in her little sitting room with the post-mortem summary spread before her like an unappetizing knitting pattern and considered the loose ends that refused to lie flat. Digitalis, absorbed slowly over days, meant the poisoning had begun before the fatal Tuesday. The sugar bowl had merely delivered the coup de grace. Someone had been adding the poison in tiny, tasteless doses, perhaps in Eleanor's private teapot at home. Perhaps in the marmalade she spread so thickly, perhaps in the herbal tonic Violet pressed upon her for nerves. The field was wider than Inspector Slack, with his comforting belief in single dramatic gestures, appeared to realize. She decided to visit the scene of the crime once more. The hall was deserted, the long table bare except for the rolled quilt brooding in its corner like a sleeping animal. Miss Marple moved quietly, her kid gloves spotless, her eyes missing nothing. The sugar bowl had been removed, but its ring of stickiness remained, a pale circle on the oak. She bent closer. Caught in the faint residue was a single crimson thread, no longer than a lash's length, the exact shade of the pomegranates on the tree of life border. She teased it free with a pin and tucked it into an envelope already waiting in her handbag. On her way out, she encountered Lydia Blackwood locking the side door, a scarlet headscarf vivid against the dull afternoon. "Such a bore, all this fuss," Lydia said, lighting a cigarette with fingers that trembled only slightly. "One can't even collect one's thimble without a policeman breathing down one's neck." Miss Marple regarded her mildly. "You left in rather a hurry on Tuesday, I believe." "Something about a telephone call?" Lydia exhaled smoke in a long, careless stream. "Darling, one has a life beyond quilting bees. A friend in town, nothing important." She tapped ash onto the step. "Though I must say Eleanor was in a filthy temper that afternoon. Threatened to expose me if I didn't mend my ways. Imagine at my age." "Expose you?" Miss Marple asked softly. Lydia laughed, but the sound cracked like thin ice. "Oh, ancient history, I was married once, very briefly, to a man who turned out to be already married. Eleanor discovered it somehow. Village postmistresses read postcards, you know, and took the moral high ground. She enjoyed that sort of thing." She flicked the cigarette away and turned to go, then paused. "If you're looking for murderers, Miss Marple, try Violet. Meek little Violet who inherited everything provided she keeps the circle exactly as Eleanor ran it. Funny how convenient death can be, isn't it?" Miss Marple watched her stride off, high heels clicking defiance, and wondered why Lydia's gloves, usually immaculate, bore a faint brown stain at the tips. Walnut stain, perhaps, from dyeing threads, or something less innocent. That evening she took a gentle stroll past Eleanor's cottage, now shuttered and silent, and noticed the foxgloves in the border, tall spears of purple bells already browning at the edges. Someone had been digging there recently. The earth was soft and dark, as though a plant had been lifted and the hole hastily refilled. She made a mental note and walked on, her mind threading possibilities together with the neatness of a running stitch. Back in her own garden, she sat beneath the apple tree and considered the emerging pattern. A debt that would never now be repaid. A secret bigamous marriage threatening scandal. A legacy tied to conditions only a devoted shadow could fulfill. A garden thick with deadly flowers. A crimson thread where no crimson thread should be. Inspector Slack saw a single murderous gesture in a sugar bowl. Miss Marple saw a quilt of many patches, each sewn with careful malice over weeks, and she knew that before the pattern was complete, more threads would have to be pulled. Gently, persistently, until the whole fabric began to give way. Chapter 5. Stitched Secrets. A week slid by in a hush of lowered voices and sidelong glances, the village outwardly calm yet inwardly taut as a quilt stretched too tightly on its frame. Reginald Thorne was released for lack of evidence beyond circumstance, and he returned to his shop pale and hollow-eyed, serving currants with the solemnity of a priest distributing communion. No one quite knew where to look when he entered a room. Sympathy and suspicion wrestled in every breast, producing only an awkward silence. The quilting circle met again on the following Tuesday. because the fete was only 5 weeks away and the border still lacked its binding. But the atmosphere in the hall was that of a convalescent ward where the patient has quietly died in the night. Miss Marple accepted her long-standing invitation at last and took the chair nearest the window, her knitting bag on her lap like any other elderly lady come to lend a hand. She worked steadily on the pale blue layette, rocking gently, speaking only when spoken to, yet her mild gaze traveled from face to face with the patient thoroughness of a bee visiting every blossom. The great quilt lay between them, its tree of life glowing in the thin October light, and every stitch seemed to carry a weight heavier than silk or cotton. Violet had assumed the presidency with the timid determination of a mouse promoted to lion. She sat in Eleanor's place, the pink rose cup pushed to one side as though it might still bite, and gave instructions in a voice that wavered between apology and command. Lydia stitched with theatrical languor, humming under her breath, occasionally holding her work to the light to admire a daring modern feather stitch that made Violet flinch. Mr. Digby, invited to remain for his historical expertise, contributed lengthy footnotes about the Digby coat of arms whenever conversation threatened to become personal. Reginald, restored to favor by default, passed a paper bag of sugared violets and tried to smile. Conversation, when it surfaced, was brittle. Someone mentioned the foxgloves in Eleanor's garden, how strangely they had withered overnight, and Violet's needle jerked, drawing a bead of blood from her finger. She sucked it quickly, eyes lowered. Lydia laughed too brightly and said one ought to wear a thimble at all times. Accidents were so easy. Mr. Digby cleared his throat and observed that foxgloves were sacred to the fairies in Celtic lore, a remark that hung in the air like an unanswered question. Miss Marple said nothing, but she noticed everything. The way Violet kept glancing at the sugar bowl now replaced by a plain white one, the faint tremor in Reginald's left hand whenever Lydia's name was spoken, the tiny smear of green on Mr. Digby's cuff that looked suspiciously like crushed foxglove leaf. She noticed, too, that Lydia had begun a new patch in the lower corner, an elaborate basket of flowers worked in silks far richer than the circle's usual cottons, and that whenever anyone leaned close, Lydia turned the frame so the patch was hidden. At 4 o'clock, tea was served with exaggerated care. Violet poured, her hand steadier now, and passed Miss Marple a cup with milk but no sugar. "We are all being so careful," she said, attempting a smile. Though of course it was only that one afternoon. Her voice trailed away. Miss Marple sipped and murmured agreement, yet her mind was on the herbal tonic Violet had pressed upon Eleanor for weeks. "Just chamomile and a little something for the nerves, dear. You've been looking peaky." Chamomile was harmless. Foxglove leaves, dried and powdered, looked remarkably similar when mixed in a dark bottle. She made a mental note to ask Dr. Haydock whether any such bottle had been found among Eleanor's effects. As the light began to fade, Lydia stretched like a satisfied cat and announced that she must telephone London about a new consignment of silk thread. She left the hall with her usual flourish, scarlet coat bright against the dusk, and Miss Marple watched her go with quiet speculation. 10 minutes later, she herself folded her knitting, said she must not tire herself, and slipped out by the side door. Instead of turning toward home, she followed the line of the churchyard wall until she reached the telephone box by the lich gate. The door was still warm from recent occupancy. Inside, the directory lay open at the page for London theatrical agents, and on the floor lay a single crimson thread, longer this time, unmistakably torn from the quilt. She picked it up with a handkerchief and tucked it beside its shorter sister in the envelope. 2 threads now, both crimson, both where they had no business to be. Someone was careless, or perhaps someone wished to be thought careless. On her way back, she paused at Eleanor's cottage. The garden gate stood ajar, and in the gathering dark she could just distinguish fresh earth beside the foxglove bed, darker, richer, recently turned again. She did not enter. There was no need. The pattern was growing clearer with every hour, poison administered little by little, affection masking resentment, opportunity wrapped in routine. Someone in that quiet room had hated Eleanor Price for years, had watched and waited and measured out death in careful thimblefuls, and now sat among them stitching innocence into every seam. Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky pricked with early stars, her thoughts moving as neatly as her needles. She was aware of being followed at a distance, soft footfalls that stopped when she stopped, started again when she moved on. But she gave no sign. At her own gate, she turned and looked back. The street was empty, yet a curtain twitched at Violet's cottage, and farther off, the light went out in Lydia's window. 2 watchers, perhaps 3. The net was drawing tighter, though whether around the murderer or around herself she could not yet tell. Inside, Cherry had laid the supper tray and was full of questions she dared not ask. Miss Marple ate a little soup, then sat by the fire with her envelope of crimson threads on the table beside her. She held them to the lamplight, comparing length and twist. Identical. Both torn, not cut. Someone had been in a hurry or in a passion. Before she went to bed, she wrote 3 neat sentences in her small leather-bound notebook. Digitalis over weeks. Intimate access required. Crimson threads. Quilt disturbed twice. Watch the hands that claim to mourn. Then she closed the book, turned out the lamp, and slept as peacefully as a child. For she knew now that the shape beneath the fabric was almost ready to reveal itself, and that very soon the next stitch would have to be taken in daylight, where everyone could see. Chapter 6. Tangled threads. The day shortened and the wind sharpened, rattling the windows of St. Mary Mead like an impatient visitor who refuses to be ignored. Inspector Slack, exasperated by the absence of any convenient villain, descended once more upon the village with 2 sergeants and a warrant to search Eleanor Price's cottage from attic to coal cellar. They found the expected bottles of lavender water and aspirin, a drawer of unpaid bills, a half-finished letter scolding the vicar about the state of the churchyard grass, but no dark bottle labeled poison in Gothic script, no incriminating diary, nothing that a magistrate would accept as evidence. The foxglove bed had been dug over so thoroughly that even the roots were gone, only a scatter of purple petals remained, already browning at the edges. Slack departed in high dudgeon, vowing to return when the murderer made a mistake, unaware that the mistake had already been made and was waiting quietly in Miss Marple's handbag. The quilting circle met again, though attendance had dwindled. 2 ladies pleaded neuralgia, and another had unexpectedly remembered a sick aunt in Taunton. Only the faithful remained. Violet presiding with the desperate brightness of a hostess whose party is failing. Lydia stitching with lazy elegance, Mr. Digby murmuring about heraldic correctness, and Miss Marple herself knitting imperturbably in the corner. The great quilt was almost finished now. Only the final binding and the embroidered inscription remained. Violet had chosen the words, "In memory of our beloved president," in scrolling letters of gold thread, and every stitch felt like a public penance. Conversation, when it rose above the soft click of needles, was brittle and careful. Lydia spoke of London, of nights at the Embassy Club, and a new play opening with a friend in the cast. Violet answered in monosyllables. Mr. Digby cleared his throat repeatedly as though something unpleasant were lodged there. Miss Marple said very little, but her mild eyes missed nothing. The way Violet's left hand kept drifting to a small bulge in her apron pocket. The faint stain of green on Mr. Digby's cuff that had not quite washed out. The manner in which Lydia's scarlet nails now bore tiny chips as though she had been digging in hard earth. At 4:30, Lydia announced that she simply must telephone her silk supplier and swept out, leaving a wake of disturbed air. 10 minutes later, Violet remembered that the gold thread needed matching cotton and hurried off to fetch it from the vestry cupboard where supplies were kept. Mr. Digby dozed gently in the draught from the ill-fitting window, his chin on his breast, his folder of notes sliding to the floor. Miss Marple continued to knit, counting stitches under her breath. Yet when the hall was empty save for herself and the sleeping schoolmaster, she rose without haste, crossed to the quilt, and lifted the corner where Lydia had been working. Beneath the new basket of flowers patch lay a small square of canvas that did not belong to the original design. It had been cleverly let in, the surrounding stitches unpicked and resewn so that only a magnifying glass would reveal the join. Miss Marple eased it free with her embroidery scissors. Concealed beneath was a folded sheet of heavy paper, Eleanor Price's true will, drawn up only a fortnight before her death, witnessed by Dr. Haydock and the solicitor from Much Benham. In it she left the bulk of her estate not to Violet, not to the quilting circle, but to a home for unmarried mothers in Birmingham, with a stinging codicil revoking every previous bequest and accusing certain persons of ingratitude and worse. At the bottom, in Eleanor's angular hand, was written, "Let those who have lived on my charity learn what charity truly means." Miss Marple refolded the paper exactly as she had found it, replaced the canvas square, and had just resumed her seat when Violet returned, flushed and breathless, clutching a reel of gold thread that was clearly the same one already on the table. Lydia followed moments later, smelling faintly of cigarette smoke and cold air. Neither woman looked at the other. Mr. Digby woke with a start, apologized profusely for dozing, and began to gather his notes with trembling haste. That evening the village buzzed with fresh rumor. Someone had seen Lydia Blackwood and Reginald Thorne together in the lane behind the Blue Boar. Heads close, voices low and urgent. Someone else had overheard Violet weeping in the churchyard at dusk, kneeling by Eleanor's newly dug grave as though begging forgiveness from the turned earth. Someone swore that old Mr. Digby had been observed burning papers in his back garden after dark, feeding them one by one into a bonfire that smelled strangely medicinal. Miss Marple listened to all of it over supper with Cherry, who repeated each tale with round-eyed relish, then retired to her sitting room and spread her small collection of evidence across the table. 2 crimson threads, the longer one faintly stained with what might have been sugar. A single dried foxglove petal found on the hall floor. A scrap of paper bearing Lydia's lipstick print in rebellious rose. And now the hidden will, photographed carefully with the little Kodak she kept for holidays and copied in her neat copperplate before being returned to its hiding place. She sat for a long time by the fire, rocking gently, the flames painting shifting patterns on the walls. 4 people, 4 motives as clear as the quarters of an appliqué block. Reginald freed from a debt he could never repay. Lydia escaping exposure of her bigamous past. Violet facing the loss of everything she had been promised. Mr. Digby, there was a darker patch altogether. Miss Marple had spent the afternoon in the church vestry consulting parish records and had discovered that the schoolmaster's grandfather, far from being the respectable squire of family legend, had died in prison for forgery. A scandal Eleanor Price had unearthed and threatened to reveal unless the Digby crest was removed from the quilt forever. 4 threads, each strong enough to hang a murderer, yet none quite long enough to reach the gallows alone. Someone had worked with cunning, scattering suspicion like chaff, hiding the true will, destroying the poison garden, stitching and unstitching both cloth and alibis. But the pattern was almost complete now. Only one corner remained obscure, and Miss Marple knew that the next meeting of the circle would provide the final stitch, or the cut that would unravel everything. She rose at last, gathered her evidence into a small lacquered box and placed it on the mantelpiece beside the clock that had ticked through so many quiet revelations. Tomorrow was Tuesday again. The quilt would be bound, the inscription finished, the The circle gathered once more beneath the indifferent gaze of the tree of life. And somewhere among those busy hands would be the one that had measured out death in careful grains of white powder, certain that no one would ever notice the tiny, deadly stitches hidden beneath the bright surface of ordinary village life. Miss Marple turned out the lamp and stood for a moment at the window. The moon rode high and cold above the church tower, silvering the rooftops, and somewhere in the darkness a door closed softly, as though someone had been watching her window and had only now decided to leave. She smiled a small, secret smile and drew the curtains. Let them watch. The time for watching was nearly over. Tomorrow the pattern would be turned right side out, and St. Mary Mead would see at last what had been sown in its midst with such patient, murderous skill. Chapter 7. Unraveling Clues. Tuesday dawned with a hard, bright frost that turned every blade of grass into a silver needle and made the village roof sparkle like newly starched linen. Miss Marple rose early, drank her tea without tasting it, and dressed with the care of a woman, preparing for a christening rather than a murder. She wore her dove-gray wool with the small jet brooch at the throat, the one she had worn to 3 coronations and 1 funeral that had turned out to be unnecessary. In her handbag lay the lacquered box containing the crimson threads, the foxglove petal, the lipstick-stained scrap, and the photograph of the hidden will. She felt no triumph, only the quiet certainty that comes when a complicated piece of lace has at last revealed its final repeat. The village hall was already warm when she arrived, for Violet had lit the stove at dawn in a fever of preparation. The quilt lay finished on its frame, a glory of green and gold and crimson, the inscription glowing like a benediction. In memory of Eleanor Price, beloved President 1937 to 1952. The words looked innocent enough, yet Miss Marple knew that beneath the lower right corner, behind the basket of flowers, the true will still waited like a serpent in a bouquet. Violet moved about with brittle efficiency, setting out cups, measuring tea with the precision of an apothecary, placing the new sugar bowl, plain white, unadorned, at the exact center of the tray. Lydia arrived late, cheeks whipped pink by the wind, a new emerald scarf at her throat that exactly matched the shade of crushed foxglove leaves. Mr. Digby shuffled in clutching a small tin box which he placed on the windowsill with exaggerated care. Reginald Thorne brought a plate of his best shortbread and stood hovering as though unsure whether he was guest or suspect. They took their places almost shyly, as though the quilt itself had become an altar, and they were communicants who had forgotten the responses. Needles flashed, thimbles clicked, the stove hissed gently. Outside, the frost began to melt in pale tears along the window panes. Miss Marple worked on the binding, her stitches tiny and perfect, yet her attention was everywhere, on Violet's apron pocket where the bulge was now unmistakable, on Lydia's quick glance at the tin box on the sill, on Mr. Digby's trembling fingers as he threaded a needle with gold silk he clearly could not see to use. At 4:20, Violet rose to make the tea. She did it openly, almost defiantly, filling the kettle from the tap in the little kitchen, measuring leaves into the pot, setting out milk and sugar with deliberate care. When she carried the tray back, her face was pale but composed. "We mustn't let poor Eleanor down," she said, voice trembling only slightly. "The quilt goes to the bishop on Friday. Everything must be perfect." The cups were poured. The sugar bowl made its slow circuit of the table. Lydia took one lump with a small, mocking smile. Mr. Digby waved it away. He had never taken sugar since his war service. Reginald helped himself absently to 3. Violet herself added 2, stirring with the calm of a priestess performing a familiar rite. Only Miss Marple declined, murmuring that she was cutting down for her figure. The cups were raised, steam curled like incense. Miss Marple set her untouched cup down and spoke for the first time that afternoon, softly, almost conversationally. "Before anyone drinks, perhaps we should remember that Eleanor herself took sugar, 2 lumps always, from a bowl that had been tampered with. The police analysis showed digitalis in the sugar, but only in the top layer. The poison beneath was older, gentler, administered over weeks. Someone at this table has been killing her since September." The silence was absolute. A coal shifted in the stove and sounded like a gunshot. Violet's hand flew to her throat. "But the will," she began, then stopped as though the words had turned to stones in her mouth. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and drew out the photograph of the hidden document. She laid it on the quilt where the light fell full upon it. "This is Eleanor's true will, sewn into the quilt for safekeeping. She changed it after she discovered certain uncomfortable truths. Violet, my dear, you were to receive nothing. The money was to go to unmarried mothers, Eleanor's final judgment on those who had lived too long in her shadow." Violet made a small, strangled sound and sank back into her chair. Lydia laughed, a short, ugly bark. "So the mouse had teeth after all?" Mr. Digby rose unsteadily, his face the color of old parchment. "This is monstrous," he quavered. "I refuse to stay and listen to such accusations." He reached for the tin box on the windowsill, but Miss Marple was there before him, lifting the lid with gentle implacability. Inside lay a bundle of dried foxglove leaves, carefully crushed, and a small packet labeled in faded ink. Digitalis purpurea, gathered 1948. "I believe," Miss Marple said, "these were meant to disappear into the stove tonight, like the roots from Eleanor's garden. Like the first will that was burned in your bonfire, Mr. Digby. Eleanor discovered your grandfather's forgery, didn't she? Threatened to tell the county archivist unless the Digby crest was removed forever. You could not bear the shame." Mr. Digby sat down abruptly as though his legs had been cut from under him. Reginald found his voice. "But the sugar, Violet poured it. Violet has been adding a little something to Eleanor's private tonic for weeks," Miss Marple continued calmly. "Chamomile and foxglove, a classic combination if one knows the dose. The final grains in the sugar bowl were meant to look like the whole crime, a clever misdirection, but the threads betrayed you both." She opened her envelope and let the 2 crimson threads fall onto the quilt like drops of blood. One caught in the sticky sugar the day Eleanor died. The other torn when someone, Lydia, I think, helped hide the new will. You have all been protecting one another in different ways because each of you had something to lose. But only 2 of you had hands small enough, and hearts cold enough to measure out death 1 grain at a time. She turned to Violet, whose face had collapsed into a mask of grief and terror. "It was you who began it, out of years of swallowed resentment. And you, Mr. Digby, who finished it when Eleanor threatened your family name. You worked together without ever quite admitting it, even to yourselves. The perfect village conspiracy, stitched in silence, bound with fear." Violet began to cry then, not theatrically, but with the terrible, hopeless sobbing of a child who has broken something priceless. Mr. Digby stared at the dried leaves in the tin as though they were the ashes of his own reputation. Lydia lit a cigarette with fingers that no longer trembled and said nothing at all. Reginald simply looked ill. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "Inspector Slack is waiting in the vestry," she said gently. "I telephoned him this morning. It is time." The quilt lay between them, beautiful and terrible, its tree of life suddenly heavy with bitter fruit. Outside, the frost had melted entirely, and the first pale stars were pricking the cold sky above St. Mary Mead, waiting for the quiet little drama to reach its close. Chapter 8. Narrowing the Seam. The vestry door opened with the soft finality of a coffin lid, and Inspector Slack stepped through, followed by a young sergeant whose boots rang on the stone floor like a funeral bell. The quilting circle sat frozen around the table, the great quilt glowing between them in the lamplight, its leaves and birds and pomegranates suddenly grotesque in their innocence. Steam from the teacups curled upward and vanished, as though even the air were trying to escape what was coming. Slack's gaze swept the room, lingered on the tin of dried foxglove leaves, the photograph of the hidden will, the two crimson threads lying on the emerald border like drops of fresh blood, and came to rest on Miss Marple with a mixture of resentment and reluctant admiration. "You might have told me sooner, Miss Marple," he growled, but the words lacked their usual bite. He had learned long ago that when this gentle old lady spoke of murder, it was wise to listen. Miss Marple inclined her head with the serene politeness she might have shown a bishop who had forgotten to remove his gaiters. "I needed certainty, Inspector. Suspicion is a dangerous thread. It frays so easily, but now the pattern is complete." Violet Hargreaves made a small animal sound and pressed both hands to her mouth. Mr. Digby sat very straight, as though rigor had already set in, his eyes fixed on some invisible point above the stove. Lydia Blackwood exhaled a perfect smoke ring and watched it dissolve with detached interest. Reginald Thorne simply stared at the shortbread as if it might yet save him. Slack cleared his throat. "Miss Violet Hargreaves and Mr. Humphrey Digby, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Mrs. Eleanor Price. Anything you say," the formal words, rolled out, heavy and inevitable. Violet began to rock gently back and forth. "I never meant it to go so far," she whispered, the words tumbling over one another like beads from a broken string. "It was only a little at first, just enough to make her sleep badly, to make her think she was ill so that she would need me more. She was going to change the will, you see. After all those years of fetching and carrying, of listening to her complaints, of being nothing but useful, she was going to give everything to strangers." Strangers! I only wanted her to be kinder, to see how much I did for her. Then Humphrey said if she were gone, the old will would stand, the one that left everything to the circle, to me really, because who else would run it? He showed me how to dry the leaves, how much to use. We never spoke of killing, not in so many words. It was like a quilt we were making together, stitch by stitch, without ever admitting what the finished picture would be. Mr. Digby's voice came thin and reedy, the voice of a man speaking from a great distance. "She found the forgery documents in the parish chest, threatened to expose my grandfather as a common criminal. The Digby name would have been mud. I am the last of the line. There was nothing else to do." He looked at his trembling hands as though they belonged to someone else. "We are not monsters, Miss Marple. We are only people who were pushed too far." Miss Marple regarded them both with the mild compassion she might have shown two children who had broken a treasured vase. "Human nature is a frail fabric," she said quietly. "It tears so easily when pride and fear pull in opposite directions. You convinced yourselves that a slow poison was somehow kinder than a sudden one, that because you never said the word murder, you were not murderers. But death by digitalis is a cruel death, and Eleanor suffered for weeks before the end." Lydia stubbed out her cigarette on the saucer with unnecessary force. "And what about me?" she demanded. "I hid the new will, yes. I helped turn the earth in the garden so the police would find nothing. But I never touched the foxgloves. I only wanted to keep my own silly secret safe. Eleanor was going to tell the whole village I was a bigamist. Can you imagine the scandal? I would have had to leave, and I like it here. The quiet amuses me." She gave a brittle laugh. "I suppose I am an accessory now. How very tedious." Reginald found his voice at last, hoarse and bewildered. "And me? I knew nothing. I owed her money, yes, but I would have paid it somehow. I argued with her, everyone heard, but poison? Never." Miss Marple turned to him gently. You were the perfect distraction, Mr. Thorne. Your debt, your temper, your fingerprints on the sugar bowl, everything pointed to you. Violet knew the police would look first at a man with a clear motive. You were the red herring stitched so carefully into the border. The sergeant produced handcuffs that glinted coldly in the lamplight. Violet rose without resistance, her face blank as though the tears had washed every expression away. Mr. Digby had to be helped to his feet. His legs seemed suddenly too frail to bear even the weight of his remorse. As they were led away, Violet paused beside the quilt and touched the golden inscription with one trembling finger. "I chose those words," she said wonderingly, "in memory of our beloved president. I really did love her, you know. That was the worst part." The door closed behind them. Lydia lit another cigarette with fingers that shook now despite her bravado. Reginald sat down heavily and buried his face in his flour-dusted hands. The quilt lay between them, magnificent and accusing, its tree of life suddenly heavy with the knowledge of what human hands could do. Inspector Slack pocketed the tin of leaves and the photograph of the will. "We'll need statements, of course. Miss Blackwood, Mr. Thorne, you will both be required at the station." He hesitated, then added gruffly to Miss Marple, "You'll come too, I suppose, to make sure I don't muddle it?" Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the unhurried grace of a woman who has just finished a difficult row, and found it perfect. "Of course, Inspector, though I think everything is quite clear now. Two people acting separately yet together, each believing the other bore the greater guilt. A conspiracy of silence, stitched with fear and resentment. It is a pattern I have seen before in other villages, in other hearts. Human beings are such frail creatures, are they not? Outside, the frost had returned with the darkness, silvering the churchyard and the silent cottages. The village would talk of nothing else for months, perhaps years. But tonight St. Mary Mead was quiet, as though holding its breath after a long and difficult labor. Miss Marple walked home beneath the stars, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and thought of the quilt that would now never be raffled, of the tree of life that had borne such bitter fruit, and of the two frail, murderous souls who had believed they could cut one thread from the great fabric of life without the whole pattern unraveling. At her gate she paused and looked back. The village hall windows glowed faintly, and for a moment she imagined she saw Eleanor Price standing there, severe and upright in her bottle-green coat, watching the departure of her killers with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had arranged everything exactly as she wished, even from beyond the grave. Then the light went out, and there was only darkness and the quiet ticking of frost on stone. Chapter 9. The Final Stitch. The village hall had never felt so small, nor the air so thick as it did on the following Tuesday, when Miss Marple requested that the remaining members of the quilting circle assemble one last time before the quilt was handed over to the police as evidence. Word had spread like frost across a window pane. By 2 o'clock the benches were filled with curious villagers who had never threaded a needle in their lives, and Inspector Slack stood awkwardly at the back with his sergeant, hat in hand, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else. The great tree of life quilt had been unrolled and stretched once more upon its frame, its colors almost luminous in the pale November light that slanted through the high windows. And every leaf, every bird, every pomegranate seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple took her usual chair by the window, laid her knitting aside, and folded her small gloved hands in her lap with the gentle authority of a bishop about to pronounce benediction. Violet Hargreaves and Mr. Digby had been taken to Much Benham the previous evening and were, even now, making formal statements. Lydia Blackwood and Reginald Thorne sat pale and diminished on opposite sides of the table, neither quite able to meet the other's eye. The pink rose cup had been removed, the sugar bowl confiscated, yet the ghost of that fatal tea seemed to hover above the tray Violet had set out of nervous habit. Plain biscuits, weak tea, no sugar at all. Miss Marple waited until the last cough had died away and the only sound was the soft creak of the quilt frame settling on its trestles. Then she spoke quietly, yet every word carried to the furthest corner as cleanly as a bell across snow. "You all deserve to hear the whole pattern," she began, "not merely the few stitches the police will trouble to examine. Murder is never a single thread. It is a fabric woven from many lives, and if we are to understand how Eleanor Price came to die beneath this very quilt, we must see how each of us contributed a strand." She turned first to Reginald. "You, Mr. Thorne, provided the loudest motif, the quarrel everyone heard, the debt everyone knew about, the fingerprints on the sugar bowl. You were meant to be the obvious culprit, the patch of bright red that draws the eye away from the subtler poisoning already at work. You were innocent of the act but not of anger, and anger is a color that shows through eventually." Reginald hung his head. A tear slid off the end of his nose and darkened the oak of the table. To Lydia she offered the faintest of smiles. "And you, Miss Blackwood, brought the distraction of glamour, scarlet nails, London stories, the hint of scandal. You hid the true will because exposure would have sent you fleeing back to the city, and you discovered almost by accident that you enjoyed the power of knowing where the document lay. You did not poison Eleanor, but you helped bury the evidence, literally in the foxglove bed, and that makes you a thread in the same dark patch." Lydia lit a cigarette with fingers that no longer shook at all. "Better a live accessory than a dead saint," she said coolly, but her voice cracked on the last word. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the empty chairs where Violet and Mr. Digby had sat for so many years. The real picture, however, was stitched by two pairs of hands that believed themselves too gentle for murder. Violet began it out of a lifetime of swallowed grievances. Every sharp word, every slight, every unpaid kindness had been folded away like fabric in a work basket, until one day the basket overflowed. She knew Eleanor's habits better than Eleanor knew herself. The private teapot, the herbal tonic taken each night for nerves, the too precise lumps of sugar, a few dried foxglove leaves ground fine and added to the tonic over weeks would make Eleanor confused, breathless, dependent. Dependence was what Violet had always craved. Only the dose crept higher than she intended, or perhaps she no longer cared. She paused, and the silence was so complete that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a heartbeat. Then Mr. Digby discovered his own danger. Eleanor had found proof that the proud Digby crest belonged to a forger transported in chains. For a man whose entire life had been devoted to pedigree, the shame was unbearable. He and Violet, two quiet, respectable people, found themselves bound by the same terror. They never sat down and planned murder together. That would have been vulgar. Instead, they exchanged small, meaningful glances, left doors unlocked, passed tiny packets wrapped in brown paper. He supplied the leaves from his own dried stock, gathered years before for an experiment in herbalism that no one remembered. She measured them into the tonic, then, on the final day, into the sugar bowl so that the death would look sudden and solitary, the work of one desperate hand instead of two frightened ones. Miss Marple reached out and touched the golden inscription with a gentleness that made several people look away. They told themselves it was mercy. Eleanor was suffering, her heart was weak anyway. A little more digitalis would only hasten the inevitable. But mercy does not hide wills in quilts or burn evidence in the night. Mercy does not let an innocent man be arrested while it finishes its stitching. She lifted the corner of the quilt and revealed the small square of canvas that had concealed the true will. With the same embroidery scissors she had used a week earlier, she snipped the tiny, perfect stitches that held it in place. The square came free and the document fluttered onto the quilt like a white moth. "This was Eleanor's final stitch," Miss Marple said. "She knew she was being poisoned. Knew it weeks before the end. The bitter taste, the tingling fingers, the racing heart. She recognized the symptoms from her own reading on herbal remedies. Instead of calling the doctor, she rewrote her will and hid it here, beneath the work of the very people who were killing her. She trusted that someone would notice the extra thickness, the slight pucker in the seam. She trusted me. A low murmur rippled through the hall, half admiration, half horror. Inspector Slack stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Both parties have confessed in full," he announced gruffly. "Miss Hargreaves and Mr. Digby will appear before magistrates tomorrow. The quilt, the will, the remaining foxglove leaves, everything will be required as exhibits." He hesitated, then added with unusual humility, "Miss Marple's account tallies exactly with their statements." Miss Marple folded the true will and handed it to the sergeant. "Eleanor's money will go to the home for unmarried mothers after all," she said. "A hard legacy, but perhaps a fitting one. And the quilt, well, the quilt will never hang in the bishop's palace now. Better it should be locked away than admired by people who do not know what it cost." She rose, small and neat and utterly composed, and the crowd parted for her as though she were royalty. At the door she paused and looked back once. The great tree of life seemed suddenly somber, its colors muted, its golden inscription a mockery of grief. "Remember," she said softly, "that every quilt is made of light and dark patches. We none of us know which we are until the pattern is finished and the quilt is turned to the light." Then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lavender and the quiet echo of truth in a room that would never feel quite the same again. Chapter 10. Tea and Truths. A thin November sun lay across the garden of Gossington Hall like a blessing that had arrived too late to matter, gilding the last bronze leaves of the beech tree and turning the frost on the lawn into fleeting diamonds. Inside Miss Marple's small sitting room, the fire crackled with applewood. The kettle sang its comfortable domestic song, and the air smelled of buttered toast and Earl Grey strong enough to stand a spoon in. The curtains were drawn against the pale afternoon, and the lamps cast circles of gold on the chintz and the polished tables, making the room feel like the heart of a seashell, quiet, warm, and safe. She had invited only 4 people to this final gathering. Dr. Haydock, because he had doubted his own diagnosis and needed the comfort of certainty. Inspector Slack, because he disliked being wrong and disliked even more admitting that an elderly spinster had been right. Mrs. Clement from the vicarage, because someone gentle was required to pour oil on troubled waters, and young Cherry Baker, who had begged to be allowed to serve the scones and hear the whole story from beginning to end. The great quilt itself was gone, rolled and sealed in brown paper on its way to a police storeroom where it would molder until a trial no one in St. Mary Mead wished to attend. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, upright yet relaxed, her silver hair as neat as ever, her hands folded over the inevitable knitting that had grown, almost by magic, into a complete layette while the village reeled from murder. She looked exactly as she had looked every afternoon for the past 40 years, and yet the others, settling into their seats with the careful movements of people who have seen the abyss open at their feet, regarded her with something close to awe. Dr. Haydock accepted a cup first, cradling it as though it might explode. "I still can't forgive myself," he said gruffly. "Digitalis poisoning, classic symptoms, and I called it heart failure. If you hadn't persisted, Jane—" "Nonsense," Miss Marple interrupted, mild as milk. "You saw what everyone expected to see, a managing woman of a certain age who had overtaxed her strength. Murder is the last thing one looks for at a quilting bee." Inspector Slack took his tea with 3 sugars and stirred it as though punishing it. "2 of them," he muttered. "2 quiet, respectable people, and they did it between them without ever saying the word. I've seen gangsters who were more straightforward." Mrs. Clement buttered a scone with delicate precision. But why, Miss Marple? Violet worshipped Eleanor, and Mr. Digby barely knew her. Miss Marple poured herself half a cup. She had never taken much tea, and added exactly one lump from a bowl that no one in the room would ever again regard as innocent. Because, she said, human beings are not simple patches of light or dark. We are pieced together from both. Violet had spent 30 years being useful and invisible. Every sharp word, every unpaid debt of gratitude went into her work basket like scraps for a crazy quilt. One day the basket was full, and the only way to empty it was to make Eleanor need her completely. A little foxglove in the tonic, nothing dramatic, just enough to weaken the heart, to produce gratitude instead of criticism. But hearts are treacherous things. They do not weaken to order. When Eleanor began to suspect and threaten to change her will, gratitude curdled into panic, and panic into something darker. She sipped her tea, pinky crooked with automatic good manners. Mr. Digby's thread was different but equally strong. Pride of family is a powerful motive. I have seen it kill before. When Eleanor discovered the forgery and threatened to expose it, his entire life, schoolmaster, historian, guardian of the Digby name, stood revealed as a sham. He could not bear it. Two frightened people, each believing the other bore the heavier guilt, stitched a conspiracy without ever acknowledging the pattern. They comforted themselves that it was not really murder if no single hand struck the fatal blow. But death does not need a dramatic gesture. It is content with a grain here, a grain there, until the balance tips. Cherry, round-eyed, passed the jam. And the quilt, miss? Hiding the new will in the quilt, that was ever so clever. Eleanor was clever, Miss Marple corrected gently. She knew she was dying by degrees and knew who was helping her along. Instead of accusing them openly, she had, after all, been a proud woman. Herself, she left the truth where only someone who truly looked would find it. She trusted the quilt to speak for her when her own voice was silenced. Dr. Haydock set his cup down with a small clink. And Lydia Blackwood? Thorne? Accessories after the fact, Inspector Slack said grudgingly. Charges will be brought, but they'll escape with fines and bound over. They kept silent out of fear for their own secrets, not loyalty to the murderers. Miss Marple looked into the fire, where an apple log broke suddenly into a shower of sparks. Fear and greed and injured pride, she murmured. The old motives dressed in new cotton prints. I have seen them all before, in grand houses and in cottages in London and in St. Mary Mead. People imagine that because we live quietly we are safe from great sins, but the heart is the same wherever it beats. A quilting circle is only a village in miniature. The same threads run through it. Love, envy, duty, resentment, until someone pulls one thread too hard and the whole fabric distorts. Mrs. Clement wiped a surreptitious tear. And now the circle is ended. The quilt locked away, 2 people in prison, the rest of us afraid to pick up a needle. Miss Marple smiled then, the small, serene smile that had comforted so many and unsettled even more. Not ended, my dear. Only turn to the other side. Patterns look different from the back, but they are still patterns. In a month or 2, the shock will fade, and someone will suggest a new quilt for the children's hospital. The stitches will be smaller, perhaps, and the conversation a little careful at first, but the needles will flash again. Life insists on going on. It is one of its most endearing habits. She reached for the completed layette, folded it with loving care, and laid it in a beribboned box. Eleanor's money will do good after all, and the tree of life will serve its purpose as evidence that truth, like good stitching, cannot be hidden forever. And we shall have our tea and our gardens and our small daily kindnesses, and we shall remember that even the darkest patch can be worked into a larger design if there is light enough to see by. The fire settled into comfortable embers. Outside, the sun slipped lower, painting the frost rose and gold. Cherry cleared the cups with reverent silence. Dr. Haydock lit his pipe and puffed contentedly. Inspector Slack actually smiled once, and Mrs. Clement cut a second scone, though she had sworn she would not. Miss Marple picked up her needles again and began a new row, the wool soft and blue as a summer sky. "A stitch in time," she said softly, almost to herself, "saves 9. And sometimes, with patience and a steady hand, it saves a great deal more." And in the quiet, lamplit room, with the scent of tea and applewood and the gentle click of knitting needles, St. Mary Mead began very slowly to mend.